The Second World War was, without doubt, the most destructive event in human history. As with all wars, there were winners and losers. And just like World War I, World War II had altered the map of the world, and new nations were created from dying empires. The same thing that happened after 1945. New countries were created, major empires continued to collapse. More people finally lived in freedom from tyranny than at any other time in world history until the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the world fell into two spheres, one of democracy and freedom in the West, and one of the iron rule and crushing repression in the East. But how did that happen? What were the casualties in World War II? Which nations suffered the worst, and why? How did that factor into the great divide between former allies? How did the world map once again change drastically? Let's find out. Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Most people know that World War II started when Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, when France and Great Britain honored their treaty and declared war on Germany. But the war in Europe was still an isolated event and pretty much contained until 1940, when Germany pushed west and conquered Western Europe, poised to invade Britain, and then pushed into the Balkans and North Africa in 1941. But many people do not know that Japan had already invaded Manchuria in 1931 and then invaded the rest of China throughout the 1930s. On June 22, 1941, Germany and its allies, Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary, invaded the Soviet Union, unleashing the largest combat front anywhere during World War II within a single geographic location. Japan then followed by attacking Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, with simultaneous attacks in Alaska, the Aleutian Islands, the Philippines, and expansion into Southeast Asia to include the colonies of Great Britain, France, and Holland, pushing all the way to India. When the United States became involved, the entire dynamic of the war changed. The U.S. did not just bring manpower. It was able to unleash the greatest industrial revolution and expansion never seen before or since. The nations at war the longest suffered the greatest lives lost, with China and the USSR being the nations that had the most deaths. All the nations suffered casualties. In comparison, Poland lost approximately 20% of its total population and almost 90% of its Jewish population. The Soviet Union, with an estimated population at that time of 195 million, lost an estimated 30 million during the war and 20 million before the war due to Stalin's pogroms and the creation of the Gulag system and his purges. China's population, by contrast, was about 503 million in 1933, and in 1945 stood at an estimated 525,680,958. The expected growth rate should have been around 600 million when removing the atrocities that nation experienced under Japanese occupation. The estimated number of Chinese killed by the Japanese is between 20 and 30 million, but this does not include Chinese soldiers killed in action. We will see that figure later. Japanese atrocities across Asia increased the total death tolls. The Soviet Union lost around 11 million due to direct military action, with an estimated 9 million civilians dying as a result of the Holocaust, purges, and other factors, with possibly 10 million who simply died of disease and starvation, primarily in Ukraine before the war with Germany. The following are a few examples, and all of these figures are still disputed for accuracy, but the following numbers are conservative but realistic estimates. Of the Axis powers, Romania had over 833,000 deaths, with 200,000 being civilians. Italy had almost 250,000 military deaths, with 152,491 civilian deaths. Japan had 2.5 million deaths, of which 672,000 were civilians. Hungary, with 300,000 deaths, with 290,000 being civilians. Finland had 96,000 from the Winter War of 1939 until the end of World War II. Germany lost over 7.7 million people, with at least 780,000 being civilians. Of the Allies, the USA lost 292,131, mostly military. France lost 213,324. Poland, 5.6 million. Great Britain, 450,700. Yugoslavia, 305,000 military and 700,000 civilians, and the British Commonwealth nations lost 373,372 collectively. Greece suffered 828,300 dead, of which 88,300 were military. China's military deaths were 1,310,224 before the Civil War after World War II. And the USSR lost at least between 24 million to 30 million people. India lost 2,087,000 in total, and the Philippines lost 807,000 in total, and so on. However, just as great a crisis was the massive refugee debacle, as tens of millions of people were displaced after the war, many fleeing what they perceived to be a new tyranny of communism. World War II changed the demographics of the world like no other conflict. At no other time in history had people from dozens of nations fled in mass migration to other nations, strangling those already hard-pressed economies. Untold numbers fled China during that nation's civil war that ended in 1949 with a communist victory, while millions more fled from Eastern Europe and the grip of Soviet communism, which engulfed all of Eastern Europe. One of the greatest singular migrations was of Holocaust survivors, many fleeing to the USA, Canada, the UK, and Eastern European Jews who knew that they would only face a new oppressor if they remained in Eastern and Central Europe, fled to Western Europe in droves. Although Stalin had agreed to fair elections in Eastern Europe at the Yalta Conference with Churchill and Roosevelt, he had no intention of keeping his word, and Churchill knew it. FDR moronically believed Stalin, himself being a supporter of Soviet-style socialism. Stalin captured the nations of Eastern Europe and installed puppet communist rulers. His logic was to build a massive buffer zone between the USSR and Western Europe to prevent a recurrence of the Axis invasion of 1941. He also wanted to be in a position to attack the West if the need arose, so he created the Warsaw Pact. Mao Zedong in China had a slightly different approach. He wanted China under his iron fist and total control of the nation, people, and economy, like Stalin. Both men wanted to export communism and enslave other people, not just their own. In the Free West, the former Allies created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to counter the growing threat of Soviet communism. The borders between the two empires was coined the Iron Curtain by Churchill. Both the USA and USSR were the prime players in trying to spread their ideology around the world, a competition that spawned many small wars and insurgencies, from Korea to Malaya, South and Central America and Cuba to the post-colonial nations of Africa. After Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev de-Stalinized the Soviet Union with a less draconian yet still firm grip on the people, but he was still a devotee of spreading communism. Mao and his comrades in communism, such as Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam, Kim Il-sung in North Korea, and later Fidel Castro, just to name a few, embraced that ideology with Soviet support. The other situation that arose was the Soviet versus British political influence in the Middle East. After World War I, the newly established kingdoms of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan were in play for political influence. The economic control of natural resources, especially oil, was the catalyst for internecine strife, which brought the U.S. into the game against the Soviets. In Asia, nationalist Chinese who were not very enthusiastic about the prospect of living under communism fled to Formosa and renamed it Taiwan. Independence movements in all of the European colonies of France and Great Britain placed a great strain, which the Soviets saw as an opportunity. Africa had not been massively impacted by World War II as it had in World War I, but they still felt the repercussions of the great upheaval, being caught between the two global ideologies. Africa and Asia would suffer decades of small proxy wars and insurgencies as both the Free West and Communist East struggled to control those nations, their resources, and establish strong footholds. The former colonies that gained their independence still faced massive internal struggles, both political and religious, with India being a prime example, which divided the country into India, West Pakistan, and East Pakistan, which later became Bangladesh. So, we can look at casualties, deaths, mass migrations, and the creation of new nations resulting from World War II, and a destroyed global economy, which was resurrected by the Marshall Plan provided by the United States. But we must also accept the fact that if not for World War II, there would not have been a Cold War, and possibly never any of the major conflicts of the later 20th century that cost even more lives. Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.